that. Okay, that's recording. This is recording. So, our names are Sam Bigham and Paige Johnson, and we are interviewing you for the IUP COVID-19 Oral History Project. We are interested in learning about people's experiences during the pandemic, and today's date is February 10th, 2023. Can you begin by introducing yourself and spelling your name?
Yep. Hillary Creely, Hilliary, Creely, Creely. I am the Dean of the School of Graduate Studies and Research.
Can you also give your age and where you were living during the pandemic?
I am 46, she says with a question mark, 46. I was born in 1976, and during the pandemic I was living here in Indiana, Pennsylvania.
And what were your responsibilities before the pandemic started, and what was the average day? What did it look like?
Before the pandemic, my professional role here at the university was as the Associate Dean for Research. And on the day-to-day, my main purview was helping facilitate the university's research enterprise. So working collaboratively with the Research Institute, which is essentially our Office of Sponsored Projects. That's how we bring in external grants and contracts to the university to support the research and creative activities of our faculty and students. I also oversaw our university research compliance, so IRB, IACUC, which protects animal subjects, export control, all kinds of federal regulations that govern how we safely do research at IUP. And I also worked closely with and oversaw our thesis dissertation office, so helping our graduate students in particular with the tail end of their kind of checkout from IUP, and our Office of Undergraduate Research to help our undergrad students engage in research and creative activity were the main domains that I worked in. Last but not least, intellectual property was also in my purview. So as faculty and students invented things or had questions about copyright, those also came to me. That was sort of my day-to-day bucket of responsibility.
Okay, so then we have a list of questions related to your experience during the pandemic, but we would like you to start where you want to. So the pandemic hits. What did you know about the pandemic when it happened? What was your immediate experience with it? How did your day-to-day change?
Yeah, so I was caught flat-footed, was unaware that there was, the possibility of a global pandemic afoot. So when March of 2020 hit, my family and I were on spring break, like the rest of IUP. We were actually in Puerto Rico and not paying attention to the world around us. We were really focused, we had very little internet access at the place where we were staying, and we were really focused on having a good time with our family. It was an extended family trip. We had my brother-in-law and his wife and their 2 kids, and my other brother-in-law and his girlfriend, and my in-laws and my husband and our 2 kids, and we were thinking about swimming at the beach and having a great time and on spring break and coming back to campus rested and ready to finish out the semester strong. My husband is a professor here at IUP. And so we were getting increasingly frantic emails from folks back here at the university, particularly around daycare and whether or not and how our children would re-enter the daycare when we came back to campus. And we thought, this is such a strange set of emails. What is going on? Why wouldn't our kids be able to re-enter daycare? And that's really when we realized that there was a pandemic and that folks that had been outside of the continuous 48 states might face some heightened restrictions upon their return. And then flights were getting canceled. And we were monitoring ours thinking, oh gosh, are we going to be spending more time here? And maybe that wouldn't be so bad because this place is beautiful. But we made our flight. We flew back on Friday the 13th of March and made it back to Indiana, Pennsylvania. Because we'd been away for that whole week, we had no groceries, no nothing. So I remember my husband hung on to the kids at home and I went to the grocery store, and it was this crazy dystopian, we have no food, I guess we should buy stuff, the shelves are picked over, what have we come home to? And I remember coming to work on that first Monday before we really knew what was going on, and we were all told to sort of, if we're having a meeting, try and stay far apart from each other. Everyone was kind of sent home that day, and then...
do you remember the date of that meeting?
If Friday was the 13th, 16th, and Monday the 18th.
Okay.
We were here, but everyone was just sort of in the hallways, kind of like giving a really wide berth, and in meetings, sitting multiple chairs apart from each other, and no one was quite sure what to do. Certainly nobody had surgical masks at that time, or face masks like N95s and gloves, and everyone was just sort of like, this is so weird, I don't know what to do. And then from there we were given the instructions from the university to telework. And so I came in and like late at night when nobody was here, because it made sense to try and minimize exposure to people, and packed up my desktop computer and took it home and set it up in my kitchen for the first week or two, and that was not a great working space. And so then I relocated to my attic, where I worked for the next, I'll have to do the math. The grad school stayed remote longer than some other offices on campus because we were able to continue to do our work successfully remotely. Mm-hmm. We had spent a lot of time before the pandemic, unrelated to the pandemic, figuring out ways to be more efficient and make better use of technology. So nearly all of our records were already digitally accessible. And so there was really very little physical material things we needed here on campus to do our jobs. And as a team, we had been working together for several years. So we all knew each other very well and had no trouble picking up the phone, shooting an email, hopping on a Teams, hopping on a Zoom call. We were already, as a unit, using a lot of Zoom. We already had an employee that was working remotely. So we were pretty well positioned compared to a lot of other offices to make that transition to working online. So that was maybe the silver lining, is that no one wanted to work online. No one was thinking about a pivot to working online, but when we were told you've got to do it, we really had no trouble as a unit making that switch, hitting the ground running, and meeting all our responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting question. Are there any artifacts about your experience that you would like to talk about, and would you be willing to donate them for the exhibit for this
I'll
project?
have to think about it. For sure, if I think of something, I'd be happy to donate it.
Like, do you have a favorite mask or like different objects or photographs that you would use during this time?
I definitely have a favorite mask, and I will donate it. And I will tell you about my favorite mask, and you'll see it in your footage of commencement ceremonies. And so I will tell you about that mask, and I will also send over a picture and a social media post I made when I said farewell to my home attic office to return to campus, which was weirdly bittersweet because, of course, coming back to campus is great. I'm so happy to be here and with our students, but I kind of got used to my quiet little sketchy attic office. But my face mask, I'll start with the face mask. A hobby of mine is quilting, and so there's a fabric designer that I'm really fond of, and one of the patterns has squirrels on it. It's a very bright. The fabric designer's name is Tula Pink. The fabric is very bright and vivid and bold, and often features just really wild themes. And so one of the series that she did had animals and nature, and so they're squirrels, like turquoise blue squirrels on a purple background. And I just think of the oak grove every time I put on that mask, and it was my favorite. It was comfortable. It fit my huge face, and I had squirrels on it, which I thought was great. And so that was the mask that I wore, whenever I could. But I made sure I wore it for our commencement exercises, which were also super unusual during the pandemic, and that they were pre-recorded and done with social distancing and great care. And the commencement exercises were some of the only events that we did during the pandemic where I actually got to see my other deanly colleagues, because otherwise we were on Zoom.
So where were those commencement
the first one that
held?
we did, I think, was in, it's not called Fisher. Is it called Fisher? Fisher
The
Auditorium? Is that right?
The one off the Oak Grove?
No, you know where they were. I had to think about it for a second. They were in Sutton Hall.
Okay.
It's not the Blue Room, it's above the Blue Room. What is that?
Gorell.
Thank you, Gorell Auditorium. The first one I remember doing was in Gorell Auditorium, and it was so weird. I mean, we hadn't seen each other face to face as deans. At that point, I should mention and back up a little bit, that in the pandemic started in March of 2020, or at least people started isolating in March of 2020. And the dean of the School of Graduate Studies and Research, Randy Martin, retired in August of 2020. And so in August of 2020, I took over as the interim dean, and then much later became the permanent dean. And so it must have been the December commencement exercises, though we'd have to check, I really don't remember, but where the deans got together face-to-face for the first time. And, you know, we have on our regalia and our face masks, and we're in Gorel, and we're all sitting far apart, and there's, you know, someone that's wiping down everything between each and every speaker. And it was familiar. I've done many commencements. I used to read the names at commencement. So when I've worked at IUP for 12 and a half years, I've done many commencements. And there are many elements of it that were incredibly familiar. But overlaying this was this really unusual, unfamiliar distancing and masking, and doing it in Gorel rather than in either the KCAC or Fisher. And doing it with a slightly different script, and it's all pre-recorded, and there's certainly no families or students. This was just delivering a commencement exercise. That was highly unusual and weird. But important to do. I think it's really critical that we find creative ways to recognize the accomplishments of our students and to celebrate these special moments, even if we had to do it in an unusual way.
Was there any other way they were celebrated, or was it just the pre-recorded graduation commencement?
As we did more and more of these, we got better at it. They had sort of the individual musicians perform and then put it together in a compilation, like orchestral piece. Certainly all the student names were still read. And then families were invited to provide images and other things to accompany it. We didn't return to sort of normal commencement exercises until, you know, fairly recently, where everyone gathered in the KCAC and celebrated kind of the way we had always. And even then, you know, still see families that are masking. And I think at this past commencement, we still didn't shake hands at commencement as the students come across. And honestly, I think it's faster when we don't. So it might actually be in the family's best interest if we just keep that tradition of just sort of smiling and congratulating everyone rather than stopping to shake every hand as the students come across the stage.
And when did the graduate school return to in-office and in-class work? Because you said it was after the rest of the college.
So we were working fully online until the end of May, beginning of June of 21. Is that right? This is the 22-23 school year, 21-22. So 21-22. So during the pandemic time, the university was also working through financial challenges. And so, unrelated to the pandemic, well, not completely unrelated, but made worse by the pandemic. And so we had some staff transitions. So our staff are predominantly members of the AFSCME union. And because there were unfortunately furloughs from the AFSCME union, there had to be much position shuffling, because with union employees, in many cases, your ability to hold a position is driven by your seniority in the union. And so because the people that were working in my area didn't have enough seniority to stay in their jobs, and they were either furloughed or pushed into other jobs on campus, I ended up with a almost whole new staff. People that they weren't new to IUP, they were people that had much more seniority at IUP, but they bumped into the graduate school positions, and the graduate school people bumped into other positions or were furloughed, depending on their seniority. And so we came back face to face in late May, early June, in order to meet our new staff and train and onboard them. I had nearly 100% turnover. And so it was one of the more impacted units from all the furloughing, because other than myself and my associate dean, Dr. Proctor, there was really not a lot of retained knowledge. A lot of our folks moved into new positions, and we received new folks. There weren't other people that didn't move that could train them up. So we thought the best way would be to come back face to face, meet our new folks, and be here face to face with them and train them, and get them up to speed on what it's like to work in the School of Grad Studies and Research. Because we received folks from very different places on campus, and so they were very talented employees doing great things, but had never done graduate school things. So there's a little bit of a learning curve, but everyone got the hang of it.
So that does go into the next question of how the pandemic impacted your work. So you had this huge turnover. Is there anything that you want to explain more about how that impacted the graduate school and the work that was done?
I mean, so for the core part of the pandemic, so when we, like I said, when we first went home, we were really lucky that we were already a really highly functioning team. I would argue the best team on campus. And that really helped, that we all knew each other really well, trusted each other, felt very comfortable just picking up the phone, sending a text, using Teams, using chat, hopping on a Zoom call. And so we were able to work pretty uninterrupted, which was great. And it gave us, that comfort gave us the bandwidth to be creative about other problems to solve. So for example, we have an annual scholars forum. It's face-to-face. Our students present their research. How could we celebrate our students? So pandemic hit in March. Scholars forum supposed to be in April. We canceled it for the first April, but by the end of the summer, what we launched instead was an online platform for the students to showcase their work. So because we were already good at working together, we could devote that bandwidth to, like, how do we solve this unique problem of creating a scholars forum for our students? So in the second year, we planned for an online scholars forum, and we planned for an online summer opportunities advancing research for undergrad students. And so we were able to really be innovative about how we did the things that were really important to the university mission in a slightly different way. And then we moved to the furlough period of our history, and had to onboard a whole new staff and train them and get a whole bunch of new folks. And it was hard. It was hard for everyone. You know, it's really sad to say goodbye to colleagues that you really enjoy working with. Maybe a little exciting for some of them because maybe the positions they were moving into were give them a chance to stretch their legs, do new skills. Sad for the folks that were furloughed completely from the university, though many of them have come back as there have been positions open due to retirement or other people moving on. A lot of them have come back, and it's been nice to see them come back. And within our unit, a chance to reimagine the work that we do and how we do it and find new efficiencies and to really try and seize that opportunity and to be positive about it. Because I think you could be really negative about, oh my gosh, all this change, this is so hard. And it is hard, but I think we really tried to maintain a positive attitude about the whole situation and about change and about the chance to really think about how we do things, how it serves students. Is this the best way to give the students what they need? So we've tried to be creative about that.
And then how did that impact the students' work during the pandemic? Because you have a lot of students writing their theses and dissertations.
Yeah.
Were any of them like cut short or had to be delayed?
It's a great question. So we were absolutely very generous and humane in our time to degree requirements that understood that, you know, life happens and people are dealing with many things. So lots of students took advantage of extended time to degree limitations. We also were very fortunate to have just really amazing leadership of our Institutional Review Board for the Protection of Human Subjects, the IRB, which you're familiar with, since I did a consent form. The all face-to-face research had to stop, at least for a period of time. And then over time, we were able to come up with protocols for doing face-to-face research safely. But in that first 6 months to a year, I mean, absolutely face-to-face research was at a halt. And that definitely delayed students who were in the data collection phase of their research. It delayed their progress towards their degrees. But we also have a really proactive IRB that tried to work with faculty and students to think, do you really have to do that face-to-face? Could you collect that data by Zoom? Could you do those interviews electronically? You know, could you pivot your project to an archival research or, you know, use existing data sets to really help students think about the work? So there are actually, at the end of the day, very few projects that had to wait. Most projects could be reimagined to achieve the same deliverable, but just in a slightly different way. But for sure, that was a challenge for students to work through. But everyone really pushed up their sleeves and tried to think creatively about how to get students across the finish line. And I think for students that were at the dissertation or thesis writing stage, I mean, it cuts both ways. I think for some students that everything shut down gave them time to focus and really do their thesis or dissertation. I think for other students, the isolation was hard. And then for other students, if you had family obligations, caring for an elder relative, caring for small children, you know, all of those things impacted your ability to focus on your schoolwork. And it, I think, created some delays. I know in my own personal life, that was probably the biggest challenge, was trying to juggle my responsibilities as a mom with very small children with working here full time, because my 2-year-old at the time, he's obviously not 2 anymore, didn't understand why we were home but couldn't play. And so, I mean, that was a constant, and, you know, how do I mother a child and work full time and transition into a new position as the dean and meet all of my professional obligations with small children. And my spouse, my husband, is the chair of the anthropology department here at IUP. And so it wasn't like either of us could say, hey, I really need you to cover the childcare, because we were both working here. So there are many classes. I think every anthropology student at IUP has probably seen or met our kids, because they popped into many a Zoom classroom discussion. There was no stopping them. And I think all of the leadership at IUP have met our children because, again, there were many a Zoom meeting that they popped into because they weren't school age, and you couldn't just sit them down with their schoolwork and say, like, Mom has a meeting, I need you to, like, focus on your algebra. You know, when the pandemic started, my kids were 2 and 5.
And now that things are returning back to normal, everyone's back in the office, how has the pandemic and the stuff you did during the pandemic impacted the way you do your work now and the way the students do their work? Is there a lot more telework involved than there used to be? Yeah,
it's a great question. We, as a university, are making better use of telework more strategically. We did a summer utility savings pilot last summer, and a lot of folks did more teleworking. You know, like maybe everyone teleworks on Friday so the campus can kind of turn down the AC and save some energy. So we, as an institution, are doing a lot more teleworking. As a dean's office, we still need to have a face-to-face presence, so we don't fully telework. Now that the students are back, we want to be here for the students when they pop by with questions. So that's probably one of the biggest changes, that we do have telework. That my associate dean, Dr. Proctor, nearly fully teleworks, because the work that she does can be done mostly remotely. She pops to campus about once a month to keep a pulse on things. But so I think more use of telework. I think we had, like I said it earlier, we had already done a lot of work before the pandemic to get all of our processes online, automated where we could. So that didn't change for us. But in having to onboard a whole new staff, we had to look at what we were doing, and that fresh perspective gave us like sort of another chance to reimagine our work. And so we tried to seize that opportunity to make better use of the systems and processes that the university has, to do even more using those tools to try and be more efficient. Because we, in addition to having turnover, we also have fewer staff than we had previously. So we really had to think about how the tasks get moved around and what's on our need to don't list, like what is the stuff we are just not able to do anymore, and what are the core functions that we absolutely need to support.
And then how has the pandemic and working from home affected your work-life balance? And now, how is it being impacted that you're back in the office, commuting back and forth?
Yeah, I think when we were working from home, we had like zero work-life balance. I mean, like truly zero. And in fact, with a spouse as a working professional, we had no work, like free time. So if my husband was teaching and I didn't have a meeting, I could do more on the childcare piece. But that work still has to be done. So we'd get the kids tucked in at 7, and like we would both go back to work and work until midnight, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, because the kids were asleep, and we could work in a focused way, because we never knew what the next day was going to hold with the kids. Was everyone going to stay healthy? Would our sitter be able to come? You know, worry. That meeting you thought you were going to have, is somebody having a meltdown and now you can't have that meeting. So we really tried to maximize the time when the kids were asleep as time to get work done. And then if we were able to, you know, have a full like 10-hour workday when the kids were awake, bonus. That it was tricky to do. So I am certain that we actually put in far more hours than the 37 and a half per week that would normal full-time. I'm sure we were each probably working like 60, 70, 80 hours a week. We were getting very little sleep, so there was no work-life balance at all. Coming back from the pandemic, come back to face-to-face, again, I think, at least in our office, because we had so much staff transition, there was another full year where, and because I was also sort of new in the dean role, there was no work-life balance either, because there was just so much to do and not enough people to do it, and new people trying to do it and doing it to the best of their ability. But, you know, it has to be done. It has to be done right, because graduate students in particular and researchers in total rely on us to do it right. And if it isn't done, it impacts our students, and we cannot have that. So we have very little work-life balance in the second year either. And maybe now I am trying really, really hard to have a little bit more work-life balance. But we as an institution are still in a difficult position financially. And so at this point, I think I have no work-life balance, but not because of the pandemic.
And then in regard to changes in your work, what changes during and since the pandemic have you enjoyed the most and enjoyed the least regarding work?
Oh, let's see. Changes I like the most. I really do like that everyone is much more technologically savvy, because pre-pandemic, we were the only ones using Zoom. I mean, not the only ones. It sometimes felt like we were the only ones on Zoom. And now everyone is used to just hopping on a Zoom. Like, it's a pretty big campus. I don't want to go all the way down to Zinc. Like, let's just hop on a Zoom. Mm-hmm. So I like that. I don't have to, deal with travel time, and people are just much more comfortable quickly hopping on a Zoom to have that conversation that you don't want to type in an email or just really can't do on the phone. The thing I like about Zoom meetings is you can share documents, because pre-pandemic I remember going to meetings and being like, oh gosh, I know that piece of information. It's in this file on my computer. But when you're in a Zoom and the conversation, requires a piece of data, you can say, oh, hang on a second, and you can just pull it up. So I like that about the better use of technology by all of us. Things I don't like. It's taken a while to build back some culture, and I think we had a really great office culture before the pandemic. I think now that we have some people that are teleworking and some people that are face-to-face and some people on different schedules, it makes it a little hard for us to all be in sync sometimes. And I think that's probably maybe the hardest is, and we have a whole new staff, so it took a little while for everyone to get used to working with each other. And luckily, like I said, we got great folks that are all really professional and really caring and really love our students, and so it was easier than it could have been, but it still took a little time to build kind of a team.
And now that things are returning back to normal, how have your work priorities and projects and job responsibilities changed?
I think they've changed a lot. Less so because of the pandemic, maybe, and more so because of the financial challenges of the university that were exacerbated by the pandemic. So, for example, I was the Associate Dean for Research when this all started, and I'm the Dean now, but we didn't backfill the Associate Dean position. So there's still a lot of responsibilities that didn't used to live with this job title that came forward to me. And as we've had a number of positions, folks have retired or accepted positions in other places, and have had some staff loss, we have not always been able to refill those positions. And so the remaining team, myself included, are doing all of those tasks. So I think, we're just all doing more with less, like everyone. I think there have been some positive things too. It's not all negative. We've really had some opportunity to engage in deep strategic thinking about where are we going as an institution in the grad school in particular, and in research in particular. Really proud of our designation as an R2, Doctoral Research University. And what does that mean? What does that mean for our students? And how do we do even more research and original creative activity? And how do we support our faculty and students in doing that? And with the limited resources that we have, personnel and otherwise, how do we best deploy them? So I think that kind of deep strategic thinking is a positive that has come of it, that we're doing more and more of than we ever have before in this office. I think that's kind of it was probably always a responsibility of the position, but I think that we're really trying to embrace that responsibility and really do meaningful things.
Now, you can ask some questions.
So, how has the pandemic affected your personal life? Like, you said you have 2 kids. Like, I'm sure that wasn't easy. I have a 7-year-old sister who was like in kindergarten at the time, and getting a kindergartner to sit through a Zoom meeting with her teacher doesn't really work out. So, how has it affected your life a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it was really stressful. I didn't have any gray hair before the pandemic. I have a lot of gray hair now. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge was trying to maintain 2 professional careers and also to be good parents. Like I said earlier, we have 2 small kids. It was highly disruptive for them. You know, we were on vacation when this all came down, and we got home, and we came home to a very different world than we left. My older child, Paxton, was in preschool at the time, and preschool ended. We're really lucky, good kid, pretty easy, loves to read. So, we were able to set him up with a lot of books, and that worked out pretty well. But at the time, our younger Lincoln, he was 2, and, there was a funny social media meme, what are you binge watching? I'm binge watching a 2-year-old. That's exactly what we were doing. Like, there was no free time. They're both high touch individuals. They were little kids. I think the other big impact for us personally was, like I said, our older child was in preschool. And so we needed to come up with a plan for kindergarten. So we needed to decide if we would enroll him in public kindergarten, which had reopened for the September of 20. With masking and social distancing. And I had faith that our local schools would do all those things. But the state guidelines on the number of positives that would lead to the schools to close, we didn't have faith that this is a community that would follow all the masking and would actually stay open. And for us, we're very fortunate. We didn't have necessarily concerns about underlying health conditions that would make a COVID infection extra dangerous. I know that was a very serious concern for many families. For us, the health concern was there, but maybe secondary to, we needed a reliable place that would be open, that the kids could go, so that we could do our jobs. And so since we weren't sure how things were going to play out for kindergarten, we created a pod school. So we joined together with 4 other families, and we hired a teacher, a retired certified Pennsylvania teacher, and we rented space from a local church, to have classroom space. And we hired IUP students to be enrichment providers, so foreign language, art, and we ran a pod school for a year, while working full-time. But that was less work than parenting the children ourselves for that many hours a day. So the kids had a school experience, but we were in complete control of the health and safety. And they masked and followed all the CDC guidelines. But because it was a smaller universe of kids, and it was families that we knew were pretty strictly following, the distancing and masking guidelines, we made the whole year without any COVID-related absences. And that stability, I think, was really, really good for our son to be able to go to school and have a teacher and have classmates and do all the things you do in kindergarten. And he had a really rich experience because she was a great teacher, and he loves to learn. And he finished kindergarten on a 3rd grade reading level, and ready to go to public school the next year. For our younger child, daycare had reopened, and so we sent him to daycare and thought he's going to be our weakest link. He's going to get something at daycare and bring it home. But daycare here on campus followed all of the COVID restrictions, but in following the COVID restrictions, had many closures. Because every time someone tested positive, they had to close. And so I think our kid was probably home with us more than he was at daycare. And that kind of discontinuity, disruption was really, really hard for him, hard for us as parents trying to work. And that, I think, made sort of the personal just really hard. Like, being a parent in general is hard. Being a parent of young children during the pandemic was really hard. I have friends who had school-age children. That was really hard. People caring for elder relatives, that was really hard. I mean, there was no easy for anyone, but I can definitely testify to how hard it was with small children.
That's amazing. You created your own little homeschooling setup. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it really did give us a chance to think and be grateful, right? Like, the amount of, like, intellectual capital it took to navigate that and set it up was not something that you would just normally be able to do. I mean, I have background in law. I work at a university. I understand how education works. The teacher that we hired is the spouse of a faculty member, so we had connections. Like, what privilege to be able to set something like that up. And then we just ran the numbers to make the cost at cost. So it was affordable for the families to do. But my husband and I, like, well, we're going to lose money on this, but it's okay. But to be able to have the luxury of being able to say, we're going to create a situation that's good for our kids, that's good for us. It was a real luxury, and we feel very, very fortunate to have had that luxury. So we know we're grateful. So it was still hard, and we were able to maybe make it less hard for us than maybe other people experienced.
Now, you said you were on vacation when all this started.
Yeah.
When you came back, when did it really set in that this was real, this was happening?
Yeah, the denial was strong for a real long time, and I think maybe psychologically it had to be, because we kept thinking, we knew on the Thursday or Friday before we left that our kids were going to be excluded from daycare for 2 weeks because we'd been on an airplane, was sort of what the CDC guidelines were saying. And so my husband and I sort of like squared ourselves, like, okay, we've just been on vacation, so we're already behind at work because we can see all the emails coming in. We've been on vacation, we've missed work. And now we're going to have two weeks with the kids at home with us while we're going to try and telework. But that's going to be really hard. But it's only 2 weeks. We can do this. We can do it. And then everyone came home. And then it was 2 more weeks and 2 more weeks. Because I have to say, emotionally, if you had told me on like March 13th that I was going to spend the next 6 months at home with my kids, with like no help. I mean, obviously my husband, but we aren't from here. We don't have family nearby. It is just my husband and I and our kids, unless we hire babysitters and things like that. Like, there's no relatives here. If you had told me that on March 15th, I do not know that I would have been able to make it. But I think because it was sort of doled out in 2-week intervals, it made it like, okay, well, we can get through 2 weeks. Okay, we can get through 2 more weeks. Okay, we can get through 2 more weeks. And eventually we did. It's probably after the first month, we did reach out to one of the trusted childcare providers from the daycare, which was closed down, to say, like, are you interested in, like, just babysitting? So during the workday, we can, in our house, like, you'll come hang out with us, be part of our bubble, so that we can try and get some work done, which we ended up doing.
So how did the pandemic change your perspective of, everything around you, your community around you, the school, economics, society, like everything? Like, how did it change your whole world?
Yeah, I think I definitely have had a lot more thoughts about gratitude. Like, I had a place to live that was safe and warm and dry. I have a job that allowed me to telework. I had a job that, barring all the financial challenges of the university, was likely to be retained. So we didn't have to worry about income. My husband is a professor and has been here for a couple of years. So even with the furloughs among the faculty, we weren't super worried about his position. So I had the luxury and the grace of knowing that we were going to be able to pay our bills and retain our health care and establish a pod school. We weren't doing anything fancy, but I think I really gained a lot of gratitude in the process. I think it was also interesting being in a rural community and kind of watching sort of the very polarizing. Folks had very strong feelings about a lot of things, but masking, right, became this really polarizing issue. And I think, that was kind of disappointing / interesting to watch. Like, it's a piece of cloth. If it keeps someone who's really vulnerable healthy, just wear it. Like, why are we even debating this? But we were debating it, and that was, illuminating as well. People felt really strongly about it. I remember going to a couple school board meetings to ask questions and talk about, what is the district's masking policy? In year 1 it was pretty strict. In year 2 it was sort of, they moved to a more optional, and that was kind of gave us some things to think about as well. But I love to see how the community bonded together as well. There were a lot of great examples of people working together in ways they hadn't before, kind of crossing those polarizing lines to just help each other. I think that was really fantastic to see. And here professionally, we're working closer with the hospital than we have in like the 13 years I've been here. I work very closely with the physician at IRMC, and we joke that it took 2 pandemics for the hospital and the university to figure out how to work together, but we finally figured it out. And we had a faculty member that was at the hospital doing same-day PCR testing, right, Dr. Barathan. We're one of the only communities in the country that had something like that going on. A rural place, supply chain problems left and right, and a faculty member doing the same-day testing, which helped our hospital stay open and have better care for the patients, because you could know if they had COVID and then allow surgeries to proceed as long as they were COVID negative. So people were getting quality care in a way that was not really possible in other rural places, and that was amazing to see the community come together like that, for the common good, to try and get through this together. So I think that was really uplifting. And so I'm kind of a Pollyanna. I tend to look at the bright side of things anyway, so that might have colored my experience as well.
Well, that kind of leads me into my next question. Like, how did it impact your personal relationships versus your professional relationships? You were saying that you had a professor here work at the hospital, but how did you get impacted, like personally and professionally?
Yeah, so I think, I think personally, I'm not afraid of technology, so it was pretty easy to like hop on a Zoom call with my friends. We did a number of Zoom happy hours. One of my fondest memories during the pandemic is my church does this Advent by Candlelight event, and we did a Zoom Advent by Candlelight, and one of the women that we do the event with had really thought about this, and she had dropped off like undecorated cookies at everyone's house, and like we did a little activity together. So everyone is like, has their favorite beverage, and we're having this little Christmas party basically by Zoom and decorating cookies, each one in their own home, decorating cookies on a Zoom call. And it was fun. It was weirdly fun. In my office, we did a Zoom Christmas party as well. And it was fun. So I think we got creative about maintaining friendships. A girlfriend and I, she came over and we sat on my porch outside in the dead of winter. I do not like cold. But it was fun. Like, everyone bundled up, put on blankets. We now own 3 of those heat lamps, and we did more stuff outside. I think my husband and I, with the kids, have now visited every single state park in Pennsylvania, because what else were we gonna do? We spent a lot of time outside enjoying nature. So I think personal relationships were strained and challenging, but you had to be creative, and for our core friends, I think we made it work, and those friendships maintained, and with the kids, with creating the pod school, I think they were able to maintain their friendships as well, and I think that was really important. So yeah, I mean, we get to know more people in our community, like I said, the hospital folks that we didn't really know previously, so there were some positives.
In what ways do you think your experience of the pandemic is similar or different to other people's perspectives and experiences?
Yeah, it was hard for everyone, and it's a different kind of hard for everyone, but in total, I mean, for sure we were privileged in coming through this. We entered the pandemic healthy, right? We don't have underlying health conditions. We talked about how challenging it is with 2 kids, right? But both of my kids are neurotypical. Could you imagine going through the pandemic if you had small children that needed an aid for some reason and you don't have access to that aid? or you're caring for an elder relative, or right, like, so I certainly can check my privilege. Like, it was hard. I'd be lying if I didn't say it wasn't hard, but certainly other people had it a lot harder. We had stable jobs, health insurance, healthy kids, access to a lot of resources that a lot of people don't have access to, and that made it, survivable.
Was there anything that you felt like you were missing out on, like, during the pandemic?
I love to travel, right? So that was tricky. We didn't really start traveling as a family again until a year or so ago. I think we took our first like big family vacation. Again, privilege, right? Like a vacation in general, and like we're lamenting we couldn't do so much of it. But I did miss travel. I felt bad about that. I had this vision before the pandemic of all these different things we would do with the kids, and all those things just had to be delayed because they weren't available to us. So, yeah, like small things like travel was probably something I missed and had to not do during the pandemic. Any hobbies or leisure time that something you've always wanted to do, like write a book. I don't want to write a book. Those things were not going to happen. While working from home, parenting, all the transitions at the university, like all hobbies have vanished from my life, except the occasional Lego building.
Was there anything of like pandemic life, like any aspects that you liked or disliked compared to now, post-pandemic?
Boy, that's a tough question. I'm not nostalgic for the pandemic. I kind of liked my small little attic office. I like coming to campus, and I like seeing the students every day, and I like the face-to-face interactions. So I'm glad to have those back. But it was okay to not have them too. I guess maybe I'm lucky in the sense I'm also not one of those folks that either loves isolation or loves people. Like, I'm kind of content in a lot of different environments. Stuff that anything I miss or would bring back or that changed. I don't know. I think maybe the thing I carry forward is just really a really constant front of mind thought about privilege.
And then, so how did the pandemic impact the way that you enjoy or engage with the world around you?
Yeah, right, the pandemic made it harder to do anything face-to-face. But it forced us all to be a little more creative. And I think to give a little more grace and say, like, people can't do a certain thing for whatever reason, and that's okay. And to be more patient and a little more understanding. To be a little bit more front of mind that, like, life happens and you might have a plan that you're going to do a certain thing a certain way in a certain time frame, and that it's just not doable. And to be a little more understanding of other people when that happens and say, I get it now, how that can happen. Yeah.
And then how do you think IUP did, or the Indiana community did, change because of the pandemic?
So I think you would approach that in a bunch of different ways, right? So certainly the national polarizing politics that we've seen, of course, happen here locally. But, and I'm not ignorant to those things, but I like to focus on the positive. And I think there are many ways that the challenge brought the community together. Again, I look at the relationship in the university and the hospital, and I look at the new ways of thinking. The university is thinking about doing a medical school, right? And some of that conversation, I'm sure, lived before the pandemic. I don't know, I'm not in those conversations, but it really moved forward, I think, because we've shown we can work together with the hospital, and I think that's really exciting. I think of the way the university worked with the local library, the way the schools made their, more accessible internet and whatnot. I just think that it forced people to be creative and solve problems on a quicker time scale than we ever thought we would do.
And so how did the pandemic affect any activities that you liked doing prior to the pandemic and the lockdown and isolation?
Yeah, so travel was harder, right? Getting some, my husband and I like to cook, so getting some of the groceries and things, like to make interesting meals, going out to dinner, right? Like minor, like first world problems. because like I said, we were very fortunate to not have to fight harder battles about, where are we going to live? Do we have access to healthcare? So we only had to worry about the keeping our children alive and the fun stuff. Traveling, eating. We had access. We live in Indiana boroughs, so we had pretty reliable internet. So we didn't have to really struggle. Like, the hardest part was when I was trying to do a Zoom meeting, my husband was trying to do a Zoom meeting, and the kids were separately on different tablets trying to do something, and like the poor little Wi-Fi for our house was not going to do it. And if that's the biggest problem, that's very manageable.
Would you like to share a memory that was very significant to you during the pandemic?
Oh gosh. I think just being really creative. So I remember we hadn't seen my parents, who live in Philadelphia, for a couple months, which was hard because the children changed so much in that time. And my dad has some pretty significant underlying health conditions, and so we really had to be careful of his health and safety. And my mom doesn't love to drive, but and they live in Philly. A couple months into the pandemic, when the weather was starting to get a little nicer, my mom loaded up my dad and drove to Harrisburg to meet halfway, and myself and the kids met, and we had this beautiful picnic, and it'll just be forever one of my fondest memories. My parents are not like outdoor humans, and so that they wanted to have a picnic, and that we had this most beautiful day in some random park in Harrisburg that I found online because I needed something sort of midpoint, and it was such a special little park that I never would have gone to but for the pandemic. And to have my mom and dad there with the kids, it was really a sweet experience that wouldn't have happened. And there were a lot of sweet little experiences like that throughout the 2+ years of pandemic.
Did you develop any new ways of enjoying the world during the pandemic, like sitting at home with your kids or anything like that?
No. No, I love to read, right? But we had the Kindle, and I am on the library board, and the library had a really creative book drop-off. So really pretty much everything I like to do, we were able to do in a slightly different way, except for flying.
So no new hobbies or anything like that?
No new hobbies. In fact, because I had been a quilter and all these other hobbies that I enjoyed, and I just haven't had time for in the pandemic. But, life is long and interesting, and maybe I'll pick those up again someday when the kids are a little older and the university is in a better financial place.
Is there any activities or forms of engagement that has carried over from lockdown to post-lockdown now?
Yeah, so as my kids have gotten older, we build with Legos all the time. In the video probably can't see, but there's Legos everywhere in my office, and we do a lot of Lego building in the household. And I think that probably is a holdover from the pandemic. It was one of the things we could do. We had these 2 giant bins of Duplo. One of them's in my office now, and we dumped them out on the floor in our playroom, and the kids and I and my husband, we just built these crazy Duplo Lego villages, and now the kids are bigger and they use regular Legos, not Duplo now, but we still build all the time.
That's great.
Yeah.
So how did the way you interact and connect with people changed from the pandemic? You talked about political polarization. Did that impact your relationships? And with the social distancing, did you find it difficult to reconnect with people when the quarantine and the lockdown ended?
It's a great question. So I'm not from Indiana, neither is my husband. And so pre-pandemic, we had already had a way of maintaining friendships and relationships that we didn't, with people we didn't see every day. So we were already making good use of the phone and email, and so those friendships weren't really changed by the pandemic because we already weren't seeing these folks every day, but still felt close to them. We got really creative about our friends in Indiana and seeing them and trying to prioritize creative ways to do that were safe. And so I think we were able to maintain those friendships. It felt a little weird. I was just reflecting on this the other day that it's really very recently that I haven't felt weird, just popping into the grocery store without a mask on, or just going to a meeting and not worrying about everyone getting sick. And so I think there was always this, even as the restrictions were like lifting, this sort of strangeness of being together that has, for me at least, just now starting to fade away. But it didn't really change the amount that I interact with people. I think I had a high level of comfort with interacting distantly because of, my friends are from all different phases of my life, and most of those phases were not here in Indiana. And so I've had to have friendships that were largely not face-to-face, and so we've just maintained that. So maybe I was predispositioned to not be particularly fazed by that aspect of the pandemic that I know for others was really terribly isolating. Plus with small children who had time to hang out.
And then how did the political polarization, did it impact your relationships with other people? Did it impact the way the university ran itself?
For sure there were things the university did that, it's interesting to hear some of those conversations. Like, what do we do about sports games? What do we do about indoor ones, outdoor ones? And knowing that, alumni, parents, students, wanted to be back, wanted to not wear masks. Not all, but like many wanted to not wear masks. And, what do we do? What's the CDC recommending? What should we do? What are other regional schools doing? What is PASHE doing to try and be safe, consistent, and all of those things. And so it was interesting to see those different perspectives, because for me it's like, just wear a mask. Like, effective, not effective, like, it's not even worth the debate. It's easy to do. If it lets us get together, let's just do it. So it was interesting to see and hear those perspectives that maybe I just didn't really think too much about previously. I don't think it really changed any of my friendships. I think it maybe just made me think about them, that, like, I guess I hang out with a lot of really like-minded people, because my friends not all, but most of my friends had the same sort of instinct, like, let's just do it to get through it. Let's just wear our mask. It's the right thing to do. We want to protect the weakest among us. There are other ways for us to get together without being face-to-face. Like, it'll be fine. Maybe, we're all in a similar privilege group as well, which made it easier for us to have, to uphold some of the distancing and the masking and those things. So I don't really think it affected my friendships. I don't think I certainly can't point to any friendships that I lost over this. I think it was interesting that some of my friends' parents or extended family relatives, or some of the care providers that we relied on at the daycare had very different worldviews, and I'd never really thought about it until the pandemic. But we managed. We managed.
So how do you think the pandemic has impacted the IUP and Indiana communities? Do you think there's been a loss of community cohesion?
I'm not sure. I don't know that I can say I see a loss of cohesion. I think I can point to many examples of actually when we bonded together. And I think we've always been a vocal community that didn't see eye to eye on things. Pre all of this, I served on our school board, and it certainly wasn't always harmonious. I can think of lots of things that we have disagreed about as a community, and this was just one more thing.
But there's still, like, community-wide activities that are occurring, or is there a lot less participation in those kinds of things?
I think there was, pandemic-related slowdown of participation. Some of the activities were canceled, or they limited the number of people that could participate. But by this past summer, I think everything was mostly running, and people are seeing an increase in participation. I think of some of the service activities. The library has evening in the stacks, and I think we kind of capped participation for distancing early on, and I think this year, we raised the cap. I think we're seeing more and more people coming out to events again as people are adapting to, like, normal.
And how would you relate the experience of the pandemic to future generations? And what kind of mindsets do you think would help us navigate a future crisis?
Yeah, I think, right, like all those things you want to teach young people, like grit, perseverance, and empathy is probably the biggest. This was a case study in having empathy and patience, creativity. I think those would be the traits to carry forward, and I think in relating the experience to a future generation, I think that's probably what I would focus on, is the way this pandemic challenged all of us to find those traits in ourselves and to celebrate those traits in others.
Is there any question you wish we would have asked, and what would your answer be to that, or is there just anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. A really comprehensive set of questions. I know I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Creely.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to share my perspectives.